In the following, I will discuss with you what the parameters Vmax, Vmax over Km, and Km actually mean. This animation was made in the School of Biosciences at the University of Kent at Canterbury. To understand what these parameters actually mean, let's write down our Michaelis-Menten equation, the Michaelis-Menten equation for an irreversible enzyme reaction. Rate equals Vmax. This is the limiting rate of this reaction times the substrate concentration divided by Km plus substrate concentration. Now, let's start with Vmax in the first place. And let's assume that our substrate concentration is very, very high. I abbreviate it like that. Substrate concentration is very, very high. And it is much higher than actually Km. So, much, much larger than Km. And therefore, if this is the case, I can write Km plus substrate concentration is very similar to the substrate concentration itself. Because Km is so small, it does not really play a big role in this sum. Of course, I can now write the Michaelis-Menten equation as V equals Vmax times substrate concentration divided by, and instead of Km plus S, I now can substitute it basically with S, with the substrate concentration. And you see, substrate concentration cancels out, and in this case, V equals Vmax. So this actually means that the rate of this reaction is equal to Vmax. But of course, this is only true if the substrate concentration is very, very high. Or in other words, Vmax tells us how the enzyme behaves at very high substrate concentration. So Vmax indicates how enzyme behaves at very, very high substrate concentrations. So please forgive me this shorthand, but I think it is very clear what is meant with that. Now, what would happen if the substrate concentration was very, very low? And the substrate concentration is much smaller than Km. Well, in this case, I can write Km plus substrate concentration is very close to actually Km. The substrate concentration itself is very small, so it doesn't make a huge difference to Km. And again, I can write the Michaelis-Menten equation as V equals Vmax times S divided by, and instead of Km plus S, I can write Km. And I can write this in a slightly different form. I can write it as Vmax over Km times substrate concentration. And what we see here is this Vmax over Km is another very important parameter, because it tells us something about how the enzyme actually behaves if the substrate concentration is very small. So Vmax over Km indicates how the enzyme behave at very low substrate concentrations. Last but not least, let's have a look what happens if Km is exactly the same as the substrate concentration. First, we've discussed if Km is much smaller than the substrate concentration. Then we discussed what happens if Km is much larger than the substrate concentration. Now we take the middle ground and ask what happens if Km is equal to the substrate concentration. Now we can write Km plus S in this case would be exactly the same as 2 times S. All I did was I substituted Km with S here. And I can write my Michaelis-Menten equation as V equals Vmax times S divided by, and instead of Km plus S, I write 2 times S. Of course, we can cancel out S, and all we've got left is V equals half of Vmax. So this tells us basically at which substrate concentration we achieve half of Vmax. So Km indicates at which substrate concentration we get half of Vmax. We can now summarize what we just discussed, and we can say Vmax is an indicator how the enzyme behaves at very high substrate concentrations. Vmax over Km tells us how the enzyme behaves if the substrate concentration is very, very low. And Km tells us something about the substrate concentration that results in half maximum or limiting velocity. Km tells us something about the affinity of the enzyme. So if Km is high, then we need a lot of substrate to reach half of Vmax. That means we need lots of substrate, and the affinity is low. Affinity for substrate low. And of course, if Km is low, which means we need only a little bit of substrate to reach half Vmax, then the affinity for the substrate is high. I hope this helps you a little bit to understand what these three parameters, Vmax, Vmax over Km, and Km, actually tell us, and why it is so important to be able to determine these parameters correctly. Thank you very much for listening.